Hi, everyone. I'm Dino Cuellar, the still relatively new president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There's a lot going on this morning in terms of war and peace, so we especially appreciate your time and your attention. In 1906, 4 years before the Carnegie Endowment was created, William James gave a memorable speech at Stanford University. There, he spoke about the fierce persistence of war in human affairs, about the need to channel the enormous energy and emotion that war could unleash to equally urgent but more peaceful endeavors. James wouldn't have been surprised by events in the Ukraine this morning. He felt strongly that American democracy would be well served by channeling what he called the patriotic pride and ambition of war to peaceful ends, but he also felt caught up in a contradiction. He also understood and felt bound to admit that, quote, marital virtues must be the enduring cement, and the obedience to command must be the rock upon which states are built in a reality of geopolitical competition and conflict. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce an event taking up the same tension that concerned James about how the venerable project of American democracy is being affected by the evolving nature of war, whether it resembles exactly what's happening in Ukraine right now or takes some other form. The conversation you're about to hear features scholar practitioners from within our network and who work at the Carnegie Endowment and have been there for a while. They'll talk about not only what Americans and the world might expect us to achieve to keep democracy limber as conflict changes, but also how. How do we maintain that lasting balance in a way that makes sense for Americans and for their values? Let me offer just two thoughts to frame the discussion today before I turn it over to our moderator. First, if you lived through the day of 9/11, the attacks in the US, go back for a moment to what that was like. The dislocation, the questions, the uncertainty about what was going to happen next. It wasn't long before legions of policymakers and commentators began making the observation that we faced a new kind of conflict that would blur the divide between global order and domestic life in the US. And of course, it was true to some extent. Guantanamo became a household word. Vigorous debates ensued about the Patriot Act that maybe foreshadowed our divisions about pandemic policy today. But the sense of discontinuity was only partially correct. There was the phrase foreign and a domestic sense in the Supreme Court's insular cases, the legal knots that courts sought to disentangle about presidential power over the domestic economy, justified on foreign policy grounds in the Curtis Wright case in Youngstown, the 1,300 police who encountered 10,000 protesters against the Vietnam War in LA in June 1967, just outside the hotel where President Johnson was giving a speech and getting an award. The entropy-like bending of certain legal rights familiar to residents at the border, and so on. So we've been struggling with this balance for a long time. But second, we're also at a distinctive moment in history on these issues, with declining trust in our institutions, loss of faith in democracy, stark political polarization, pervasive cyber vulnerability, changing geopolitical power, and of course, the conflict playing out in Ukraine. It's not ever been straightforward to reconcile American democracy, national security, but the balance is almost certainly going to get more fragile before it gets firmer. Fortunately, our panel is here to help us with a solution. Maybe they'll find one in the next hour or so. At least they'll advance the discussion. And we're going to be very well served by one of my Carnegie colleagues leading the discussion. Rachel Kleinfeld is the senior fellow I've long admired in our Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. She helps governments and civil society understand how democracy can remain vital and when and how it breaks down. She coined the term privileged violence, also one of the country's foremost experts in the dynamics of political reconstruction and sustaining democracy. She's the founding CEO of the Truman Project and a Rhodes Scholar. If she wasn't already here at the Carnegie Endowment, I'd be trying to hire her right now. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tino. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to introduce our panel. And after Tino's incredible introduction, I'm going to keep it fairly short on the introduction of the topic. We're joined by Ona Hathaway, Joshua Kleinfeld, who also happens to be my brother, but is here by dint of his ability, not our nepotism, and Leslie Payne. And I'll just take them in alphabetical order, and then we'll get started. Ona is the Gerald C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law and Counselor to the Dean at Yale Law School. She's been one of the foremost experts in this area of war powers at Yale, but also outside of Yale. In 2014 to 2015, she left Yale to serve as special counsel to the General Counsel for National Security Law in the U.S. Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Secretary of Defense's Award for Excellence for her work there. And since then, she's published more than 25 law review articles, many of them and also many popular articles about the issues of war and how we make it in the United States and where our democracy has gone wrong over the last number of years. Her research has led her to be the author of The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World. And she's been very interested in the legal efforts to control and confine war over many, many years. She's also on numerous committees that I will not name here because we really want to get into the substance, but they're impressive. Joshua Kleinfeld's a professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and also in the Northwestern Philosophy Department. And in 2017, 2018, he was a visiting professor at Harvard and Stanford Law Schools. He teaches and writes in 3 areas: legal and political philosophy, legislation and statutory interpretation, and criminal law and procedure. And in those areas, he's been doing some really cutting edge work, for instance, in criminal law and procedure on reconstructivism, looking at how criminal law is not just about retributive justice or utilitarian theories, but it's really about healing a society and serves a social function to recreate the norms of society after they've been broken. He's also been involved in criminal justice reform, defending children accused of homicide in the Juvenile Criminal Defense Clinic at Northwestern, and many other things. And his policy proposals in that area have worked to move criminal justice in a more democratic direction. Before law school, he worked as a senior research analyst at the White House's Council on Bioethics. Leslie Adrienne Payne is a political scientist at the Rand Corporation, so we have one non-lawyer to join me in the non-legal field. She has extensive experience on the ground doing anthropological field research in kinetic environments, which for the rest of us means war. Prior to joining Rand, she was a deployed social scientist with the Department of the Army's Human Terrain System. She served 2 13-month tours embedded with the Army in combat units in Iraq and southern Afghanistan, earning the Achievement Medal for Civilian Service, the Commendation for Meritorious Civilian Service. She served as an intelligence officer and military analyst with the CIA, focused on former Soviet states, West Africa, and also international private military firms. And at RAND, she's done a great deal of work on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and civilian military relations, including writing a college textbook on these topics. So we're in extremely good hands. Today, obviously, with the specter of the Ukraine over all of us, it's impossible not to think of a traditional war where tanks roll into a major city and everyone knows what's going on. And yet, even with this war that we're watching unfold on our TV screens, cyber attacks started days earlier. The probing of the systems, of the financial systems and so on started weeks ago. And these things might have been interpreted as acts of war or might not have. In many other recent wars, the early days were even harder to tell what was going on. And whether something was a war or not could be hard to tell. Was the launching of the Stuxnet virus in 2012 an act of war against Iran? And if so, who did it? Was some of the attacks that we've had in democratic countries against democratic elections through mis and disinformation, are those acts of war? They're certainly acts against our democratic system. If so, who do we blame? How much of them are domestic? How much of them are foreign? These new forms of war with rebels, with hybrid warfare and so on, challenge greatly the ways of distinguishing between war and peace. And at the same time, our democracy is being challenged because, of course, our Constitution gave the right to declare war to Congress. Our Constitution and our founding fathers were really trying to prevent a monarchical executive who could just lead the country into war willy-nilly with no checks and balances. And yet, for decades now, Congress has really abdicated a great deal of that power back to the executive for a variety of reasons. So while pushing for Congress to take back its power over the executive and to be able to check an overweening executive that has really gained an immense amount of power in the last few decades, we're faced with this kind of warfare in which it's harder and harder to make determinations of war and peace, particularly given the committee systems, the intelligence issues, and all of the other siloing that happens on Capitol Hill, much less the partisanship that's going on up there. So these are really tough issues of democracy and war, and we can't have a better panel to discuss them. I'm going to start with you, Ona. One of your recent articles starts by declaring the US Congress hasn't approved the use of force since 2002, and yet the United States has not been at peace in the years since. Can you just take 5 minutes to do a better job than I just did, laying out the problem we're facing with Congress, its ability and willingness to declare war, maybe start with the War Powers Act of 1973 and a couple of the violations since, so people get a feeling for the texture of the problem?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's great to be here. So I think that the place to start is where you did start, which is with the constitutional structure around the question of who is it that's able to authorize decisions to use military force on behalf of the United States. And the Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of the military, but it gives Congress the power to declare war. And Congress has a number of other authorities connected to the war power. It's authorized to make the decisions about whether to pay for war, whether to issue letters of marque and reprisal, which don't really exist anymore, but nonetheless signal a kind of central role that Congress was intended to play, not just in all-out war, but even in sort of more minor conflicts with foreign powers that would resort to military force. And so there's no real disagreement about what the original constitutional vision was. The original constitutional vision was that we would not go to war unless both the president and the Congress were behind it. There have been, we could detail the many instances in which that has not been perfectly observed over the years. But let's begin with Vietnam. We all know the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did authorize the military intervention there, though there were some questions as to whether Congress had actually been properly informed. But as that war dragged on and Congress increasingly felt kind of impotent in the process of making decisions about whether to continue the military operations or not, and then news came out that the president had ordered bombing of Cambodia that had not been disclosed to Congress. Congress certainly hadn't authorized it. That helped unleash an effort in Congress to try and claw back some of the authority that had been ceded to the president over the years. And that was done through the War Powers Resolution. So the War Powers Resolution in 1973 is a law that was passed by Congress that basically sets up a kind of structure for the relationship between Congress and the president when the president wants to use military force. And it says that the president needs to seek authorization from Congress. First of all, he needs to report any uses of force or deployment of forces to areas where they are involved in hostilities or likely to be involved in hostilities. They have to report that within 48 hours. And then once 60 days have elapsed, if Congress has not authorized continued involvement in those hostilities, the president has to withdraw those troops, and he can have an additional 30 days for that withdrawal period. So it sets up a kind of process of reporting, and it sets up a process that basically says, well, if the president does deploy troops to areas of hostilities, he has to get some assent from Congress before too long. Several things have happened to that. One is it does not appear to have been the intent of Congress to effectively give the president a 60-day blank check, but it's sometimes interpreted that way. I think wrongly interpreted that way. That this is effectively like the president can do whatever he wants for 60 days, and as long as he gets it over by then, everything's good. That was not the intent of the War Powers Resolution. The intent was actually to restrain authority, not give away additional authority, though recognize there are moments when the president might have to act quickly and doesn't have the capacity to seek assent from Congress. So that's one problem that's emerged. And the second problem that's emerged is that the War Powers Resolution is centered around a term that hadn't really been used significantly before the War Powers Resolution, which is this term hostilities. And it says that if the president deploys troops to hostilities, engaging in hostilities, or to areas where they're likely to be involved in hostilities, that's what triggers this process. And over the years, executive branch lawyers have interpreted hostilities in ways that restrict the situations in which the president is constrained by the War Powers Resolution. And probably the most infamous of these is when the Obama administration deployed troops, deployed military force in Libya, not troops on the ground, but generally Air Force, contributed to NATO operations in Libya in 2011. The administration interpreted this extensive air campaign that the US was participating in as not hostilities subject to the War Powers Resolution. And for many, this sort of signaled that the War Powers Resolution was effectively a dead letter, because if a major bombing campaign that led to the end of the Gaddafi government is not hostilities, then, kind of what is? Is it only if we have massive ground troops? And frankly, in the modern era where we have drones, we don't have many ground wars. And so if it just means you can't put lots of troops on the ground without Congress, that's a very small limitation on the power of the president to wage war on his own.
Ona, I'm gonna stop you there and go on to others, and then we'll come back to this, because I know we could explicate the number of times this resolution has been broken for the rest of the hour, frankly, for exactly the reasons that you're saying. But holding that in parentheses, Joshua, can you take us back to the beginning? Walk us through some of the intent of the founders at that constitutional moment. What were they looking at in terms of our system of government versus other systems of government? What were they trying to do? And how do you think that intent has been altered has been affected over the years by the interpretations of the executive or the negation of Congress? Oh, you're on mute, I think. And watch your chats. I'm going to be a dictator here. I know we're talking about democracy, but I'm dictatorly in our chat about 5-minute rules.
Well, that was a rookie mistake right there, having my mute button on 2 years into the Zoom age. But thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm grateful for it. Grateful especially to be doing this with my sister. Rachel and I have been waging a 2-person campaign against the partisanship of the age. Her as a progressive and me as a conservative. We've been reaching across the aisle to do various things together that seem important to us on democratic first principles. And I think this is a case in point. So thank you, Rachel, for including me in this discussion. So on that note, many conservatives have conveniently lost sight of the Originalist Constitution when it comes to executive power over war. You hear from many conservatives functionalist, quasi-living constitution arguments about why executive power is absolute. And as Ona was saying, the framers' vision was anything but pure executive power. In fact, Ona has been one of the bravest and most insightful defenders of the original constitutional structure of our time. So what is that original structure? The division of power between Congress and executive was that Congress gets essentially, as Ona referred to the textual provisions, the explicit right in Congress to declare war as well as to make rules for the management of the military, for the conduct of the military, and to appropriate funds for the military. And the president's right to act as civilian commander-in-chief in times of war. And the essential idea is that Congress decides to use force, and the president carries war forward once it has been declared. There was always an exception for emergency situations, like an immediate response to an attack. But really, the constitutional structure for making war was part of the original genius of the Constitution. You separate the decision as to what the law is from the doing of it, from the decision of what is to be done from the doing of it, the making of law from carrying it into execution, which is so very distant from our current vision of the president as policymaker and the war-making context of the president as sometimes unchecked policymaker. This was an explicit, self-conscious, and textually inscribed decision to depart from the European system where all war powers were held by one entity. And the framers talked about it a great deal. So Alexander Hamilton, for example, said in one of the Federalist Papers that the president's war power is to be, and I quote, in substance much inferior to the British king. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces once they have been called into effect. the calling of them would appertain to the legislature. So why this constitutional structure? It's one thing to say just it's true as a matter of positive law, but another to say why the founders put that into place. I think there are two reasons still extremely relevant to us today. One is based on democratic first principles and the other on historical experience. The democratic idea is that the philosophical idea at the root of our system is that to the extent a decision affects us as we the people, imposes costs on us as we the people, it belongs to us as we the people. There's supposed to be a connection as a matter of democratic control between who a decision is affecting and who has voice in making that decision. The antithesis is to have a European-style autocrat who simply decides the fate of the people whom he rules over. So nothing has more effect on us than the decision to go to war. Nobody bears those costs more heavily than the democratic people. So the decision has to be in their hands. And incidentally, the framers thought about making the decision to declare war one that the Senate and president engage in together. And at the Philadelphia Convention decided explicitly that it should belong to the Senate and the House, not to the president at all, because the House was seen as the most directly responsive to the people. So I want to stress that this is not a functionalist argument. This is a legitimacy argument. It's not about checking the president. It's about the majoritarian character of the original Constitution. And the second point about historical experience, Rachel, I'll be very brief about this. It is more functionalist. There is a long European history of executives being too venturesome, of embroiling their countries in wars for territorial gain or aggrandizement or even personal offense. The contemporary updating of that experience is war for ideology, war on the basis of the president's individual conception of right and wrong. The founders were worried about an agency problem where the cost fell on the people and the gains on the president. So they put in place Congress's power as a checking function. And again, it was explicit. Jefferson talks about how the declaration power in Congress was, quote, one effectual check to the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body, from those, I love this phrase, from those who are to spend to those who are to pay. Oh, Rachel, I think you muted now.
No. So as Joshua just laid out, the constitutional framers had a very clear idea of what they were doing. Ona talks about how the Congress updated that in the 70s after Nixon went into Cambodia, really, and overstayed his welcome in that war. And Congress decided to rein him back in. And since then, nearly every president has violated this act. Actually, George W. was one of the few who didn't, because Congress gave him such immense powers. And so one could say that legally, perhaps he didn't violate because the AUMFs that he was granted were so very vague after September 11th. The spirit of the law quite possibly was violated there. But most of these violations, Clinton's airstrikes in Kosovo, Trump's Syrian airstrikes against chemical facilities, Obama's Libyan airstrikes, and so on, Reagan's ground troops in Grenada. These were very clear. You can tell when war starts. You can tell when war ends. You can tell when the clock starts running and so on. Leslie, I'd like you to reflect on events of the past decade. I mentioned the 2012 Stuxnet cyber attack. We've seen the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 with irregular troops, the 2017 deaths of the 4 US troops in Niger, and so on. How is the changing nature of warfare itself affecting this kind of legal interpretation of what is happening with war? What is war itself? And how do we know if war is occurring?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you also to Tino and my fellow panelists. I'm definitely in very esteemed, privileged company, so I'm happy to be here. So, Rachel, I think the very straightforward explanation, and I will speak succinctly because I do know that we're cognizant of time, but the very straightforward explanation, thinking about the several examples you just mentioned, is that there is a degree of ambiguity that characterizes many of these offensive acts, where the jury might be out as to whether or not they're even considered acts of war in the first place. But they certainly have a certain patina that might be reminiscent of acts of war. So, in my estimation, there's a new paradigm at play that invites a reasonable amount of confusion. So your questions are very valid, because especially with the examples you just mentioned, acts of warfare can seemingly occur in the absence of an official war, and often with zero retaliatory gestures, despite admissions of culpability. So what this has created is layers of difficulty. So it's true that in the absence of traditional peer-to-peer or state-on-state conflict with identifiable catalysts and identifiable objectives, we instead find, for example, asymmetrical matchups, such as when the U.S., for example, declares war and expects to engage with Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces. We find sub-state actors with few or no concerns for Geneva Conventions. We also find adversaries that commit crippling and combative acts with soft footprints, but devastating consequences. So, for example, such as the Stuxnet attack you mentioned, and other crippling cyber attacks. So lines, when conflicts start and stop, these lines become blurred. And really what we're seeing is the perpetuation of hybrid warfare. You mentioned hybrid warfare a few minutes ago, and essentially it's a strategy that blends non-military and military action, with cyber attacks often, with the regular warfare tactics, sometimes information warfare, and maybe even economic pressures to induce a desired result. So, for example, foreign electoral intervention is considered a form of hybrid warfare. So interestingly, Russia might have engaged in such activities with the US as its target, yet never outright declared war on the United States. And in instances where it's hard to prove, plausible deniability often finds footing.
Thank you so much. Ona, you've suggested some new legislation or some outlines for new legislation, some of which ended up in legislation this year in the National Security Powers Act of the Senate and the National Security Reforms and Accountability Act in the House. How would that new legislation help clear up some of these issues that Leslie's mentioned, that you've mentioned, and Joshua's mentioned in reforming war powers and helping deal with this new form of warfare, and yet restoring democracy to where it's supposed to be in terms of the balance of powers between the executive and the Congress?
Yeah, I mean, so both the House and Congress have been interested in this issue. They've shown a kind of willingness to open the door to conversations about, reforming war powers. The two pieces of legislation that you mentioned, the National Security Powers Act and the National Security Reforms and Accountability Act, include war powers reform, arms export reform, and national emergencies reform. So they're kind of trying to address a host of problems, among them war powers reform. These are efforts to try and repair some of the damage that's been done to the War Powers Resolution, plug some of the holes, and actually get Congress involved again in the process of making decisions about going to war. There's a separate initiative in addition to this, which is the question about whether the existing authorizations for use of military force put in place by Congress now 2 decades ago, in particular the 2001 authorization for use of military force, that is the basis for a lot of our counterterrorism operations around the world. There's a discussion about whether to repeal and replace that authorization. It's a separate discussion from war powers reform, but really important to have both of these happening at the same time. And so both of these are on the table in a way they haven't been, since I've been closely monitoring this really in the last couple of decades, that we really have a clarity that there's energy behind this. Nonetheless, it really takes unprecedented collaboration between both parties and both branches, and right now we're not seeing a whole lot of that.
Indeed, we're not seeing a whole lot of that. Joshua, I wanted to turn to the courts. The courts helped create some of the situation we're in. There's the 1983 ruling against the INS and so on. These new laws, if we pass them, have provisions that would set up the courts as the body that can force the executive to follow the law. It basically gives the House and Senate standing and a cause of action to bring a lawsuit and requires expedited review and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the courts here and bringing them into this democratic structure in terms of playing referee between a more powerful Congress or putting Congress back in its rightful place and the executive?
This is a sad story. I think there's reason to be skeptical that the courts will perform that function. So the history of the courts in this domain has been one of extreme avoidance. Through a combination of not granting cert, which means refusing to hear the case, or ruling certain cases non-justiciable, for example, saying that they involve political questions the judges can't resolve, or invoking rather obscure standing rules, which are essentially procedural objections, the court has avoided having to enforce the constitutional text giving Congress the right to declare war. So in Vietnam, the court refused to review the constitutionality of challenges to the undeclared war no fewer than 8 times, 8 separate cases, Mitchell v. United States, Luftig v. McNamara, Mora v. McNamara, on and on and on. The court persistently refused to rule on the constitutionality of the undeclared war. In 1999, there was a challenge to the war in Yugoslavia, Clinton's war, which was not based on a congressional declaration. The DC Circuit ruled it non-justiciable, and the Supreme Court refused to take cert. So if you look at the pattern in sum, you get a vivid impression of a court that just doesn't want to decide these matters of war and peace, does not want even to enforce Congress's sort of requirement to make the decision as to whether we get embroiled in war. I just, a little bit of editorial commentary. It is infuriating to me because the court so often wades into contested values issues with no clear constitutional mandate. And as a conservative, I often object. I think, what is the court doing getting involved in the culture wars? What is the court doing involving itself in the contested values issues of the day? But then when there is a clear constitutional mandate, a clear textual mandate, and an unmistakable historical kind of permission for the court to say, Congress has the right to declare war, they refuse to get involved and leave it to the political branches to decide. So nothing gives the lie to the way judicial review currently functions in America more than this: the court wading into issues where it has no textual or historical mandate and refusing to get involved in constitutional issues when it does. Quite apart from that editorializing, it makes the problem under discussion at this moment severe. The constitutional structure gives Congress authority over the declaration of war, over the use of large-scale force. The president is ignoring that structure. Congress seems unwilling or unable to prevail in its competition with the president, and the courts are unwilling to intervene. And I would like to, at some point maybe in this discussion, hear more from Ona about how her legislation would get the courts to do a job they've been historically so far unwilling to perform.
Indeed, and I hope that we will either get that through Ona directly or through the Q&A. You should have all just seen the little banner ad come up saying, please send us your questions. We will try to get to them. But I want to turn, we've been speaking a lot about law, and now I want to turn to the war side because, of course, democratic legitimacy doesn't just rest on process. It has to deliver outcomes. And perhaps the biggest outcome that people ask of their government is to protect them. And so I want to ask each of you, starting with Leslie and then Ona and then Joshua, if Congress was able to reassert its power, this Congress, not an idealized Congress, but the Congress we are with, reasserted its power to declare and limit war, how do you think that would actually work in terms of deterrence against enemy nations, our ability to support allies in a situation like the Ukraine right now, Taiwan, and so on? How would it affect our actual war fighting? I'm asking to speculate, so don't get scared. No one's holding you to it, but I would love your thoughts. So starting with Leslie. You're muted. We're all going to do it.
I usually pride myself on not having this happen. It is a rookie mistake, and so Joshua, you're not alone. So I just made it also. Ona, maybe you'll follow suit. Who knows? So thank you, Rachel. I think maybe a precursor question for me might be, what emboldens our adversaries in the first place? When we think about whether or not a reassertion of this power to declare war can work in terms of deterrence. And then maybe after that, to what extent is congressional action a factor in the equation at all when we think about it serving a certain type of power in terms of deterrence? And so what I would offer is maybe with a break of about a 4-year period or so, I think the United States has, in a pretty consistent manner, communicated to its allies and partners its intent to stay committed geopolitically. And of course, this level of support might vary with the conflict in question, but I think in real time right now, maybe with the exception of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, our allies have been relatively convinced of our support. And I think the leadership roles we've assumed, especially with the current crisis in Ukraine, has underscored that. Where I think the difficulty lies is in combating, select perceptions, many of which are held by our adversaries, that America, for example, punches below the belt now, that it no longer retains hegemonic status, or that status has waned, that America might be weaker in the overall sense, and several things might be able to remedy those misperceptions. I'm not sure how strong of a role a reassertion of congressional power might play in that, especially if a parallel perception exists that Congress itself as a governing body is perhaps weakened or racked by partisan infighting, maybe panders to constituents too much, or is racked by indecision. So if this perception was the dominant one, I don't think it would affect our warfighting per se, but it might embolden our adversaries to test our limits and our resolve.
Thank you, Leslie. Ona, I want to ask you a variation of the theme, so feel free to answer the whole question, but particularly I'd like to hear your thoughts on small-scale special force deployments for clandestine or covert missions. So, for instance, the recent strike by the Biden administration against against al-Qurayshi in Syria. I'm sorry about that. The Trump administration against Soleimani in Iran, Obama against Osama bin Laden. How would a reassertion of congressional authority affect those sorts of clandestine or covert special operations types of missions? Or should we not be engaged in that in the first place? I mean, these are sort of assassination missions, and we actually have a law against that. So I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, so a lot there, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think just to the broader question, what would it mean for Congress to reassert itself, and how would that affect war fighting? I think one really powerful and important benefit that would come about clearer rules that restrict our use of military force to instances where Congress is supportive of the operation means that we're not going to launch wars that we don't have the entire American government behind. Now we can launch a war with just the president behind it, and who knows what the next president's going to think of that military operation, whether he's going to want to sustain it or not. So if you have stricter rules about when we can wage wars, and it requires both branches to be behind it, you're much less likely to wage wars that we're not going to stick with, that we can be counted on to carry it through to the end. And I think that's really one extremely important benefit. To your question about these kind of special operations missions and the like, it depends a bit on what the reform looks like and whether it's going to address these kinds of operations or not. And it's worth noting just briefly the kind of technical legal distinction between Title 10 and Title 50 operations. So there's Title 10 operations, those are Department of Defense, primarily Department of Defense operations. They may be clandestine, meaning that they are kept hidden for the time being, but they're eventually meant to be disclosed. And then there's CIA operations, covert actions, which are where the role of the United States is not intended to be known. And they're separate legal authorities for the two. So even if we change the rules for Title 10 operations, that might still retain authorities to engage in Title 50 operations. I do think when there's a 360 view of what how we authorize military operations, we ought to sweep within it the question of whether we ought to be doing these small scale operations and the degree to which these should be a part of our warfighting effort, and whether we're really engaging in operations that are changing things substantially in a positive way on the ground. I think we tend to take it for granted that these counterterrorism operations are actually shifting things in the right direction. It's not entirely clear to me that that's the case. And I think hopefully part of this is an assessment of what works, what actually is important for counterterrorism, and whether rather than military force, we should be deploying more effective foreign assistance, rule of law reform, a whole host of other kinds of changes on the ground that might actually shift things in a more positive direction than deploying military force, whether small scale or large scale.
I think that the last one is a really important point. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, but we wouldn't have been able to get Osama bin Laden or whatever. But then thinking, well, what's really changed because of this and that and the other activity is incredibly important. Josh, I'm asking you the main question, but I'm also going to put a riff on it, just as I did for Ona. So you've written about the issues of democratizing our criminal justice. I really can't speak today. And I wanted to talk about the US, UK, and French joint strikes on Syrian chemical warfare. Now, this seems like kind of a no-brainer. There's a chemical warfare plant. You have a horrible dictator who's proven that he'll use these against his people. And after Syria reportedly used chemical weapons, the UK strikes claiming humanitarian intervention. France strikes claiming it's upholding international bans on chemical warfare. Trump administration strikes claiming basically nothing at all. It said it had Article 2 powers to use violence and doesn't even really bother to make an argument. On the other hand, and so one could argue, based on what Ona has just said and so on, that we just shouldn't have done that this was the wrong kind of strike and we should be upholding the law. On the other hand, Obama declared a red line in Syria, went to Congress, tried to get congressional approval. The intervention failed in Congress. And then he did some training and equipping and so on. But some blame that motion, going to Congress and failing, for Russia going into the Ukraine in the first place and that first step in. And I just want you to take those two situations in Syria seriously. What are the repercussions potentially of taking Congress's role seriously?
Well, I love the framing of the question. I love the thought that democratic processes are judged by outcomes and not just legitimacy. I think the fundamental consequence of restoring Congress's power over war would be to bring executive action more in line with popular will, and in so doing would lead to less venturesome executive entanglements. We would avoid some disastrous foreign policy entanglements that we've gotten in Iraq, for example, or in Libya and elsewhere. But there would be substantial costs. I want to acknowledge those costs in terms of maintaining commitments to allies, establishing credible deterrence, and so on. There would be the foreign policy establishment's view of warranted force would have less influence over policy. So what I want to fundamentally do is challenge the conception of good foreign policy underlying the question. The founders' concern about executives being too prone to use force and get entangled in foreign affairs has proved warranted. It's been 230 years, and it has proved warranted. It's proved warranted in our time. And those costs of embroiling us in bad wars with disastrous effects are so high that to have the people through Congress saying no to a lot of them is worth the cost, although I acknowledge that the costs are very high. So what constitutes good foreign policy is first and foremost a matter of democratic legitimacy. What we effectively have with the current system is a foreign policy establishment that constitutes, along with the president, a sort of ruling class, and that ruling class dictates when and how we use force. It's essentially an intellectualized process among a group of specialists. I think that's democratically illegitimate. It's also very unwise. A lot of the problems in the world are not our concern. That's not a pragmatic claim. That is a moral claim. A lot of things are genuinely not our concern as a moral matter. Many of the engagements we get embroiled into are not worth the cost, which is also a moral claim. It has to do with the duty of a government to its own citizens. And many foreign engagements are difficult to control, and I'm always struck at how little the foreign policy establishment seems to appreciate how difficult they are to control and how badly they can go wrong. So I think that while the cost to deterrence and credible commitment to allies and elsewhere would be high, they're well worth it. I just want to mention one other thing, though, and I am cognizant of time. I think it might be possible to mitigate some of these foreign policy costs. by taking advantage of the changing nature of warfare. If the president can engage in low-level uses of force where major democratic interests are not at stake, for example, these targeted strikes. I'm not talking here about regime change or large-scale troop deployments. I'm talking about targeted strikes, preferably pursuant to an earlier congressional authorization like the AUMF. Then I think it might be possible for the executive to maintain some credible commitments and some credible deterrence without getting us excessively embroiled in violating democratic first principles. So I might be actually more favorable to those small scale operations than the others on the panel or some of the others.
Well, Joshua and I spent maybe 35 years arguing about human rights and these kinds of issues in various different levels of sophistication. And I'm not going to get into it here, but I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about this. In some ways, it goes back to Biden's foreign policy for the middle class and so on, of really reassessing how many of us in the foreign policy establishment resemble the remarks that you're speaking of here, Josh. But if you don't use force, or if you don't use large-scale force, one of the other ways that we get involved in the world in order to mitigate things that we see as not in our interests is through more expeditionary civilian engagement. And this has been ramped up over the last number of years. It's also had a lot of problems for these expeditionary civilians who are in non-kinetic roles but can come into danger, like the US contractors who were kidnapped in Colombia, for instance. So Leslie, you've written about this, and I'd love for you to say, say we take this route, we engage less militarily, but we potentially are engaged more through prior action, prior to military engagement, trying to help states, doing missions where we're training their militaries or where we're training their governance functions so that they're stronger governments in themselves. At what point should congressional oversight start calling these hostilities? What about locally focused stability operations and so on? So where does that line between expeditionary civilians and actual hostilities start breaking down?
Thanks, Rachel. So let me make sure I am off mute. Indeed, I am. So a few things. So in terms of locally focused stability operations, these are less common these days because those tend to normally be relegated to the realm of counterinsurgency operations. But locally focused stability operations does beg an interesting question, because when these were mainly undertaken during OEF and OIF, they weren't subject, to my knowledge, they were not subject to congressional oversight at all. And that's because they were just that. They were very local initiatives. If there was oversight that took place, it probably was done by the US military units or the host nation military forces that were on the ground. However, I think the issue of expeditionary civilians or US contractors is definitely one we ought to consider, because congressional oversight over US contractors per se, especially security contractors. So the majority of expeditionary civilians, you're right, they do not engage in kinetic activity. However, some actually end up doing so. And so the examples are countless and aren't necessarily relegated to high profile cases like, for example, the Blackwater contractors in Nisour Square in Iraq. But there have been efforts to monitor and assess contractor personnel, especially those that have operated within the intelligence community, the IC. So especially throughout the wars, the IC workforce, the intelligence community workforce, became this kind of bifurcated mixed bag of professionals performing various categories of work for the US government. And in fact, pressure steadily mounted for the IC to keep watch over its contractor workforce. And the contractor workforce was considered vital. And you're absolutely right. So if we consider or advocate for the US adopting more small scale, kind of low level missions and operations, as both Joshua and Ona have mentioned, whether or not these include special operation forces or not, there will be an increased need for congressional oversight of these particular types of missions. So in the case of contractors and expedited civilians, for example, I was actually one of those contractors as a deployed social scientist in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the particular program that I was associated with, the Human Terrain System, did receive high levels of congressional scrutiny and media scrutiny, and the program had to be accountable at the end of the day. So what I've witnessed, and I'd be interested to hear from Joshua and Ona on this as well, is that these particular type of operations have not evaded congressional scrutiny and oversight. And my guess is that if the U.S. were to engage with them with frequency in the future, they would, just as they have in the past, be subjected to a fair degree of scrutiny and assessment.
Let me follow up directly on that because, Ona, I know you've written about congressional oversight, and you've basically said Congress is overseeing these 21st century wars with a 20th century oversight structure. And I've had my number of times up on Capitol Hill just stunned at how one committee doesn't know what the other committee is doing in these very complex modern wars. Can you talk a little bit about what would Congress need to do internally if it was going to exercise power seriously, if it was going to take back some of these abilities and really run a serious job?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I wrote an article with a couple of my students on modern warfare oversight and really dug into this question. And what I was struck by is that for most of these operations, for nearly every operation, someone in Congress is informed. There is reporting to a committee for almost everything, with a few narrow exceptions. But the difficulty is that they don't talk to each other. And in particular, the intelligence committees who oversee all the intelligence operations, covert action, really don't share any information with the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Armed Services and SFRC and HVAC don't really talk to each other. It's a very siloed system. And as a result, nobody in Congress really has a kind of capacious view of what's actually going on. And they don't have a sense of what our full-scale military operations might look like, and also what the various alternative options might be. There might be cyber alternatives to use a military force. There might be special operations forces going on in a country that other kinds of operations are being authorized. And Congress may have no idea about that. And on the executive branch side, we have the National Security Council. And the whole point of the National Security Council is that our leaders in the intelligence community get together on a regular basis to talk about and coordinate around military operations and other kinds of national security operations. They meet on a very regular basis. Anybody who's been in the executive branch knows that, there's a tempo of the DCs and the PCs that run our national security establishment. There is no equivalent on the congressional side. They don't talk to each other. And as a result, they're really disarmed by that. They don't know what is really going on. And so one of the proposals I make, which I know is not super likely to get off the ground, is that Congress could solve this problem by creating its own equivalent of a National Security Council, or at least some mechanisms for better coordinating among and between these committees, or at the very least, have some cross assignments within the committees and have staff who have some awareness of what's going on in the various committees and collaboration across the committees. Instead, what we have is a lot of territoriality on the committees. Members of Congress who are on various committees don't really want to share information with members of other committees because they're afraid that their authority is going to be challenged. And that has really disabled Congress in its ability to have any significant impact in a lot of these cases.
Really interesting, and also pretty daunting, because first we have to change a law and then we have to change committee structures, which anyone who's dealt with Congress knows is a lot of congressmen have served a long time and don't want that changed. But Joshua, I actually want you to talk about congressional turnover. So you've got your committee chairmen who have served a very long time and don't want to give up their committee chairs and are causing some of the problems Ona's talking about. But right now, congressional turnover has been such that fewer than a fifth of the sitting senators have ever authorized the use of force, fewer than 1 in 7 House members, because the last authorization was for Iraq in 2002. So we have this democratic idea that if a representative votes for something and the public doesn't like that something, that representative gets voted out. That's how democratic accountability is partially supposed to work. It's one aspect of democratic accountability. But politically, there's an awful lot of downside to voting against most wars. Even though most Americans don't like the continuation of wars, they do seem to like getting into wars in the first place. And there's very little upside to voting against most wars. And Barbara Lee's taken a couple of such votes and so on. But how could Congress be convinced politically to take these powers back and take votes that might, as you say, put them in the same wavelength of where the democratic public is, but maybe before the democratic public gets there, and maybe without a lot of the accountability mechanisms that would help?
Well, I think democratic processes matter somewhat more than the premise of your question implies. I mean, the Iraq War affected Bush's campaign in 2004 and McCain's prospects after that. It definitely affected Hillary versus Obama. Obama took great pride in his opposition to it and got some votes from that. Biden's Afghanistan exit will probably cost him some votes. So I think the American public ultimately cares about foreign policy mistakes, especially ones that cost a lot of lives or money, that take a lot of time, as you said, or just humiliate the country. But I think there's a larger question at work here that Ona was just addressing and that you're addressing as well, which is how to get Congress to exercise the powers that they're supposed to exercise. And it's one of the great political questions of our time, not just in the war making or the foreign policy sphere, but sort of across the board. The framers envisioned each branch jealously guarding its powers and trying to expand them and meeting opposition from the other branches. But the story of Congress in the 20th and 21st century has been one of delegating lawmaking and other responsibilities, sort of refusing to exercise its constitutional powers. And it goes beyond that as well. I think this was something implicit in your conversation about the committee siloing in Congress, namely that Congress often seems unwilling or just incompetent to face its responsibilities. You know, I worked for the Bush administration in DC, and you just can't hang out in DC circles with people who are involved in government and not hear the constant refrain, warranted in many instances, that Congress is just incapable of real governance, incapable of thinking or acting in the ways it was constitutionally envisioned to act, and that real governance has to be in the executive branch because that's where the competence is. And I think there's some truth to that. So I have a name for this. I call it the most feckless branch problem. Ona will recognize the borrowing. There's always the famous phrase, the least dangerous branch. So Congress is the most feckless branch. And it's a real challenge to people like Ona and me, and one of my great influences, Bruce Ackerman. We want to invigorate Congress's role in democracy because of democratic first principles and constitutional rule of law principles. But Congress doesn't seem capable of exercising that responsibility. I do not think there's an easy solution. I'm not going to be able to design the restoration of Congress in, the last few minutes of our time together. But I think pragmatically, there has to be, in this context, what we can look for, and Ona might have designed it, there has to be a mechanism by which the executive is forced to ask for legislation and the legislature is effectively required to give it, something akin to the war powers clock, where 60 days after the initiation of hostilities, the president has to ask for permission, and if Congress doesn't give it, it triggers a withdrawal within 30 days. Something like that sort of structure is the only repair to Congress that I can see at present in this context.
Thank you. Well, I had a killer set of last questions for everyone, and then I was just told by my program associate, who I always listen to, that I need to end on time. And so I'm going to end with Leslie. And we've talked about what could the executive branch do to rebalance. If Ona has any last thoughts on that for 30 seconds, I'd love to hear what an executive branch lawyer could do. We've talked about how the courts need to exercise their constitutional responsibilities here. And Josh, if you have any way to compel the courts to do that in 30 seconds, I would love to hear that. But Leslie, we haven't talked about the military. Is there anything the military could or should do to ensure our wars regain more democratic legitimacy and support? We've gained this extremely professional military that's become quite siloed from the American people. And I'm wondering if there's anything that portion of our government could do.
Allow me to unmute myself. I may have to candidly say, Rachel, that I might, I might have to actually get back to you on this answer, or just think more deeply about it. I'm not sure what would be within the military's purview in terms of helping the situation. And I also open it up to Ona and Joshua if either of you have a more sophisticated response that I just offered. But I'm not fully sure what would be within its remit in terms of how to affect this problem for the better. I'll be perfectly honest with you about that.
Fair point, and rare in Washington, D.C. It's clear that you're actually in California, because rarely does someone in D.C. admit to actually not knowing something and close an answer off. It's a valuable skill. Ona, Joshua, do you want to comment on anything the executive branch could do or the courts could do?
I'll just jump in to say, I think one of the challenges here is that we always rely on the executive branch lawyers to be the source of the limits. And I think that that's not entirely fair to executive branch lawyers. That's not really appropriate to rely on them to be the only break between illegal action and legal action. If the courts are not willing to weigh in, if Congress is not going to play its constitutional role, relying on the executive branch lawyers alone, which more or less is what we've been doing, is just not going to be adequate. I think we've discovered that that's the case over the years. We really need to have a more reinvigorated role for the courts, and there are various things we could say about that in terms of congressional standing and maybe giving standing to members of the military to challenge illegal military operations. We need a much more invigorated Congress. These war powers reform efforts, I think, are important to that. The executive branch lawyers need to do their job and do their job well, but I think that putting all the onus on the executive branch lawyers, which we have been doing, is a recipe for failure, unfortunately.
Thank you. And Josh, any last thoughts on the courts?
I think solving these problems of congressional indifference or apathy or fecklessness and executive illegality will fall to the courts to some extent. But I think we need to be fully cognizant of how difficult it is to get the courts to act in a domain they don't want to act. Just think about partisan gerrymandering. There's legislation in place requiring the Supreme Court to hear cases about partisan gerrymandering. And yet it has managed to rule that problem non-justiciable and keep itself out of a domain that it doesn't want to get into. It is very, very difficult to force the court to enforce the Constitution. It's not a solution, and it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean that the central constitutional problem here is quite substantial.
Well, thank you. I think we can see why the executive has ended up taking these overweening powers over time. And I think we can also see what harm it's done to our democracy and so on. And yet the rebalancing clearly suggests to me that we would move toward a less interventionist foreign policy, or maybe a more volatile foreign policy of presidents getting into things and publics pulling them back, which is interesting at this particular moment in our history as conflict is going up and democracies are under siege. And so I think these are real problems, and it's rare to have a serious discussion of real problems in Washington that don't follow clear lines. And so I'm incredibly grateful to all three of you for a really serious and thoughtful discussion of a really hard problem that I hope you all and we continue to tackle and move forward on as a country. Thanks so much.
Thank you.